Hello, my name is Matthew Waddington. I'm the Senior Legislative Drafter at the Jersey Legislative Drafting Office, and this talk for the CALC conference is about our project on rules as code, which I've been working on with three colleagues, Heather Mason, Kate Hanna, and Zoe Rilstone. What we've been looking at is drafters parsing their drafts for the if-then logic that lies behind what we do, and the ways in which drafters might be able to mark that up on their drafts, or at least produce a shadow draft with minimal amounts of redrafting to illustrate that. So our project looks at rules as code from the drafter's end and is very much non-techie at this stage. We want to look at those ways of marking up drafts. We are looking at rules as code. There are two other speakers in this session about rules as code. I'm not going to spend too long on some of these slides because I'm assuming that they'll be made available, or if not, then you can get them direct from us. And they do have links such as these here that explain what rules as code is about. The idea behind our project is to involve local tech firms later on, but local policy officers for now, and start with our drafters. And this paper is just a progress report. It's not a completed project. So there's plenty more to do, and we welcome anybody interested getting in touch. Before we start, just to look at where we're heading for, we want to get something so that drafters can mark up in order to feed that into some sort of an app that will check your draft for you, that you can use to check it against examples, cases, and that you can use to generate flowcharts and decision trees and that sort of thing to make sure that you and the instructing officer are both on the same page with something. We'd also hope then that that would be able to feed into external software providers producing something that was more sophisticated. We have already used very crude ways of doing this, so Excel is available to everybody, and the if-then logic available in Excel can be used to produce answers to questions where the questions just use the text of the law. Much more sophisticated is DataLex from Ostly. Again, it uses the text of the law to produce questions which then give you answers using the logic of the legislation. There's also Q&A markup editor, which is also linked off here, which gives a questionnaire system. So starting at the beginning, our issue with rules as code is that it's become very, very techy, and the drafter side of it hasn't gone as far forwards as needs be. So we're looking to add drafters in. The point being that when we're drafting something, we already understand the logic that we are trying to encapsulate in our draft. But very often that logic ends up very complicated because you have exceptions to exceptions to exceptions, and it makes it difficult to follow for the drafter, for the policy officer, and certainly for other lawyers and members of the public. So the question is whether we can flag that logic in a way that a computer can read. We want to look at how feasible that is. We want to look at trying to do it in ways that drafters can do without becoming coders, staying as drafters. And we're not trying to do the fancy things that a lot of the tech solutions are trying to do, such as calculating numbers or dates. So all we're trying to capture is the logical structure. Our minimalist approach is that we're not in any sense trying to capture, in this example here, what person means. The fact that it means a legal person as well as a natural person fools the vast majority of lay readers, I would imagine. We're not trying to capture what alcohol means. We are trying to capture the fact that commercial operator has been defined, but the commercial operator definition gives body corporate. We're not trying to capture that. We're not trying to capture engage in business for profit or public house or hotel. What we are trying to capture is these highlighted bits: must not, if, and, or, means, but, not. So one of the things that we would want to emphasize we're not trying to do is put drafters in any kind of a straitjacket. We are saying that drafters should be able to continue drafting in the way that best suits the English reader, the human reader of English text for that particular draft. But there are 101 ways in which you can say, if a driver carries a passenger, the driver must do something or other. Ensure the passenger is belted or drive slower or whatever it might be. So you can say a driver who carries a passenger, a driver carrying a passenger. You can have this paragraph applies, that paragraph applies. We don't want to stop people using those, but we are fairly convinced that they are all logically and legally equivalent to if then. So we want to be able to pick that out. The easiest, well, I say the easiest, the most natural, obvious way to try to do it might be with colour markup. So if a person drives, the person must wear a belt. Simple legislative proposition. In that, what you have is a person drives marked in yellow because that is the conditions, that is the bit before the then, if you're going to say if then. And then the person must wear a belt is the effect, the conclusions. So that's here marked in blue. And then the link between them is that this is an if proposition. So mark that in light green. If it was if and only if, we'd have marked it in dark green for the sake of this case. The trouble there is that marking with colour becomes difficult as soon as you leave the if wording. So a person who drives and a person driving, we end up colouring the words with two colours, which could get confusing. If then is not only about that kind of legislative proposition, it's also about definitions, because effectively a definition is saying if something meets this definition, it counts as this defined term. That's a means definition. If it's an includes definition, then the difference is just that the means one is if and only if, and the includes one is if but not only if. So you can try simple color markup again there. So here we've got this example with selling alcohol, commercial operator, and also defining fraud, but the fraud is an includes definition, so it's the light green. This is not the only kind of fraud. The commercial operator is the dark green, because this is the only thing that counts as a commercial operator. So the trouble with colour is, as I say, it becomes difficult the more you are putting things together. So once you put the if then and the definitions together, you end up wondering how to colour commercial operator and fraud where they first occur in this. So again, we've used double colouring. But there are also obviously other kinds of definitions, particularly the classic one with brackets and quotation marks, and how to colour that and which bits to colour again becomes more difficult, less obvious. Then there are other things that can be parsed as if then statements. So there are these slightly odd uses of must in legislation since we've dropped shall, where we say a notice must contain the following information, or an appeal must be submitted within so many days. And effectively what we mean is that if you put the information in the notice, or you submit the appeal in time, then you will have the legal effect that we talk about further down the line. So this notice will have the effect that if you're served with it, then you must comply with it. The appeal, if it's correctly submitted, will have the legal effect that the court or tribunal must entertain the appeal. Then there's the classic must and must not cases. Code, the original writer of the first drafting manual, treated this as the main thrust of any legislation. If somebody does something, then that person must do something else. We can also cast the must itself as an if-then by saying if the person doesn't do that, then the person is in breach of this provision. And off that you can hang offences or whatever other consequences there might be. Often, of course, when duties are imposed on public sector bodies, we don't expressly say anything about the consequence of not complying with a public sector duty, because we leave it to judicial review. You can also colour code for and or. We have sophisticated ways in our drafting of using paragraphing and indenting to show what's covered by and what's covered by all. You can use colour to illustrate that, to pick that out, but it again starts to get complicated if you mix and or, and it gets even more complicated at the bottom of that example there if you're mixing if then with the and or. And we're reaching the limits of usability of colour coding by that point, really. All is not lost just because colour coding isn't necessarily the ideal answer. There are other ways of applying markup to text. And the most obvious thing for everybody, I think, is mouse over. This idea that when you roll the mouse over a highlighted term, something pops up. We're all familiar with Wikipedia. If you roll the mouse over a Wikipedia term that has an entry, it will pop up a little taster box of that Wikipedia entry. And people have used that already for defined terms in legislation, so that you roll the mouse over the defined term and up pops the definition. So that's an obvious thing that could be done. It's an obvious illustration of what we mean by markup that flags some status of the logical status of that piece of text. Many drafting offices are already using drafting tools that have XML, which is very much designed to be able to tag the text. And Legal Rule ML is built on that idea and already has tagging for if and then, as illustrated there. There are problems with these systems as well, in that many of them don't like overlapping tags. HTML that web pages use is okay with overlapping tags, but XML, Legal Rule ML, not so much. The alternative to having just the text with some markup on it is the drafter producing a second text, a shadow text, which is not enacted, it's not official, it's like explanatory notes, it has that kind of status. And the idea behind that would be that the secondary version is machine readable. That might sound like a big deal, but in fact there are already 2 systems that can do this, or 3 actually. There's Datalex with its YScript system. There's Bob Kowalski's Logical English. There's also the Oracle Intelligent Advisor system that I have on one of the previous slides. The point is that we are very disciplined in how we use English now in modern Commonwealth drafting. And we have that rigor and that discipline almost to the point of being what the tech people would call a controlled natural language. English that is computer readable because certain rules have been followed. So we haven't yet got to the point of getting a system that can read the English, but we've experimented with ways in which you could potentially redraft something so that it becomes computer readable. So this here, we're using block capitals for the if or if and only if, the and, the not, the or, and the then, and then using the indenting that's familiar to drafters to distinguish the and bits from the or bits. And then this one here also uses what I was talking about earlier. The person must not sell alcohol becomes, and if the person does sell alcohol, then the person's in breach of this provision. But apart from that last twist, all the rest of that text is straight out of the original draft. It's not rewording it. So it shouldn't be twice the work. It sounds like it might be, but it should be relatively easy if we've got it in a way that is familiar to drafters and that is just reusing the text they've already written. But it will also mean, it might take a little longer than to write this, but it will mean that you can then use it to check that everything's working correctly. So it will save you time in getting it wrong further down the line. If the draft ends up very convoluted once you've turned it into this shadow draft, then that might well be a sign that there's a problem with your original draft. So the example I've got here is from 20 years ago, from a time when people used to like compressed drafting, very compressed. And the trouble with that is the exceptions and the exceptions to the exceptions and the layering on top of each other that can get people lost. So in this example here, we've got things about cartridges not exceeding certain diameters, but that's an exception to an exception. There's a couple of otherwises, there's some contravening, there's an offence split into 3 limbs, which possibly could have been 3 offences. And by the time you've worked all that through, you are in the logical version getting beyond the level of indenting that we would normally be happy with in drafting. So that seems to us to be an indication that this is possibly too compressed for a human reader, as well as very compressed for the machine to read. That's as far as we have got so far. We're going to carry on, and we are going to look at other ways of marking up and other ways of doing this rewriting. We've already had a few goes with that, some more formal than others. In the end, as I said at the beginning, the idea would be that you would be able to do this so that it can be checked as you're drafting it. The tweet that I've just included on this slide is somebody talking about the possibility that drafters in the end could get an editor system that is like coders have, that flags up for you as you go whether your syntax is working, your logical syntax is working. And one day we might end up looking back at drafting just with Word and wonder how we ever did it, in the same way as we now look back at drafting before word processors and think, how on earth did we ever shuffle paragraphs around, rejig things, and produce the kinds of well, take things through the kinds of changes that we do when we're drafting. So I hope that is useful to people to see what we're up to. If you're interested in that, you can follow us or you can get in touch with us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.